The rain that clung to Arthur Covington's tweed jacket was a scent of the outside world, an organic memory of wet asphalt and fallen leaves that felt alien in the sterile, climate-controlled air of the Soho loft. He closed the heavy, brushed steel door behind him, the sound a definitive, echoing thump that sealed him inside this gallery of a life he supposedly shared. The space, designed by a minimalist architect Sloane had discovered in a glossy magazine, was a testament to her aesthetic. Vast, white, and unforgiving. Polished concrete floors stretched out beneath towering windows that framed the bruised twilight of the Manhattan skyline, a city of relentless ambition that was her natural habitat, not his. His gaze swept over the Italian leather sofa that looked untouched by human contact, the single, aggressively abstract painting that had cost more than his annual salary, and the cold marble island in the kitchen where no one ever cooked. To him, it wasn't a home. It was a showroom, a stage set for a life he was merely a background character in. He shrugged off his jacket, the fabric damp and smelling of wool and academia, and slid the worn canvas strap of his backpack from his shoulder. The bag, a faded olive-drab companion from his college days, landed on the floor with a soft, heavy thud. It was a sound of substance, of paper and history, a stark contrast to the hollow echoes of the loft. Inside that bag was a universe she couldn't comprehend, a legacy of quiet power bound in leather and ink, a truth far heavier than the sum of its physical parts. He could feel the weight of it, not just on his shoulder but on his soul, a constant, silent promise he was beginning to fear he had betrayed. The subtle chime of the private elevator announced her arrival, and the atmosphere in the room instantly shifted, the air growing thinner, charged with an energy that was both intoxicating and corrosive. He braced himself, a quiet ritual of self-preservation he performed every evening, preparing to become the man she expected him to be. The real man and the secrets nestled in the worn fabric of his bag would have to wait. Sloane entered the loft not as one returning home, but as a conqueror surveying her domain. She moved with a liquid grace that was meticulously practiced, her stiletto heels creating a series of sharp, imperious clicks against the concrete, a sound that always made Arthur feel like he was being measured and found wanting. She was dressed in a sheath of dark gray silk that seemed to shimmer under the recessed lighting, a piece of wearable architecture that probably had a name and a four-figure price tag. Her scent, a complex and expensive fragrance with notes of sandalwood and something metallic, preceded her, colonizing the space and erasing the last traces of his rainy, bookish world. She didn't greet him with a kiss or even a word, but with an appraisal. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, flicked from his slightly rumpled corduroys to his worn leather shoes, and finally, with a barely concealed grimace, to the olive backpack sitting by the door. "Arthur, must you leave that thing right there?" she asked, her voice a low, smooth melody that had charmed venture capitalists out of millions. But to him, it was a finely honed weapon. "It looks like something a vagrant would carry." He offered a small, tired smile, the kind he had perfected over years of similar comments. "I'll move it. Long day." He bent to pick it up, the simple act feeling like a concession, a small surrender in a long, undeclared war. She was already moving past him, her focus on her phone, her thumb scrolling with a ferocious intensity. "I have the pre-call with the board in 10 minutes. I need absolute silence. The Northwood deal is at a critical juncture." She paused, her back to him, and added as an afterthought, "I hope your day of discussing dead presidents with teenagers was fulfilling." The condescension was so casual, so ingrained in their dynamic, that it was almost mundane. But tonight, it landed like a tiny shard of glass in his heart. It was in these quiet, dismissive moments that the chasm between them felt most profound, a gaping void filled with her ambition and his secrets. If you enjoy stories of karma and hidden secrets, subscribe now to see how the quietest man in the room can sometimes hold all the power. He carried the backpack into his study, the one room in the loft that was truly his. It was a sanctuary of controlled chaos, a rebellion of wood, paper, and leather against the stark minimalism of the rest of the apartment. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, built from a warm, dark cherry wood, overflowed with books. First editions of Faulkner and Hemingway stood shoulder to shoulder with dense historical tomes and volumes of poetry, their spines a rich tapestry of color and texture. The air here smelled different, of aging paper, worn leather bindings, and the faint, sweet scent of pipe tobacco from a pipe his grandfather had once owned, and which now sat in a place of honor on his desk. It was the smell of legacy, of a world that valued permanence over profit. He placed the backpack gently on the large, leather-topped desk, his fingers tracing the frayed edges of the canvas. This bag had been a gift from his grandfather, Edward Sterling, on the day Arthur had left for college. It was a simple, practical object, but it was imbued with the weight of memory and a solemn promise made on a deathbed. It was his portable vault, the unassuming vessel that carried the tangible proof of a life lived in parallel. His hands, usually so steady when handling a fragile, 100-year-old manuscript, trembled slightly as he reached for the main zipper. The sound of the metal teeth grinding open was unnervingly loud in the quiet room, a sound of revelation. He wasn't just opening a bag, he was confronting the duality of his existence. He was Arthur Covington, the mild-mannered history teacher earning $55,000 a year, a man Sloane tolerated as her pro bono project. But he was also the sole heir to Northwood Holdings, the anonymous principal of a $2 billion trust, the very entity Sloane was desperately, slavishly courting. The irony was so bitter it almost choked him. He pulled back the flap, the interior a dark cavern of secrets. He could see the edges of manila folders, the corner of a worn leather-bound journal, and the glint of a heavy, old-fashioned key. Each item was a link in a chain that bound him to a power he had never wanted to use, a force he had kept dormant out of love for a woman who now saw him as little more than sentimental clutter. The weight of his grandfather's words echoed in his mind, a quiet but insistent whisper against the backdrop of Sloane's impending conference call. The promise was not just to protect the fortune, but to find a partner worthy of the man, not the money. And every day, the evidence mounted that he had failed spectacularly. Later, the silence she had demanded was broken by the controlled, confident cadence of her voice leaking from her home office down the hall. Arthur sat at the massive, empty dining table, a plate of food he had prepared for himself growing cold before him. He could hear her through the closed door, her tone shifting seamlessly from charmingly persuasive to ruthlessly efficient. She was performing, weaving a narrative of exponential growth and disruptive innovation for the faceless names on her conference call. She used words like synergy, scalability, and burn rate with an easy fluency that made her sound like a general commanding an army. He picked at his roasted chicken, the flavor lost on him, his senses attuned only to the sound of her voice. He heard his own name mentioned once, and his fork froze halfway to his mouth. "Of course, my husband is incredibly supportive," she was saying, a saccharine sweetness coating the words. "He's an academic. He keeps me grounded. Reminds me that not everyone is built for the kind of pressures we face in this industry." Arthur closed his eyes. It was her standard line, the carefully crafted, patronizing narrative she sold to the world. He was her anchor, her quaint reminder of a simpler life, the intellectual pet she kept at home. It was a public humiliation disguised as a compliment, a way of defining him as small so she could appear larger. He could picture her in her office, leaning forward, her expression intense, selling a vision of a future he was not a part of. He was just the dusty museum curator, as she'd once called him in an argument, a relic to be managed while she built her empire. The conversation shifted to the mysterious investor, the one she was banking everything on. "Northwood's due diligence is exhaustive," she said, a flicker of genuine stress momentarily breaking through her polished veneer. "But they're the ultimate prize. The principal is a legend, a complete recluse. Getting him on our cap table would be a paradigm shift." Arthur opened his eyes, a cold, heavy certainty settling in his stomach. He was the legend. He was the paradigm shift. And he was sitting here, alone, eating cold chicken while the woman he had promised to love and honor painted him as a gentle, simple-minded fool to the very people who managed his fortune. The chasm between them was no longer just a void. It was a battleground. And he was beginning to realize he had been disarmed by his own love and patience for far too long. His gaze fell to his wrist, to the watch that was a quiet, constant companion. It was a Patek Philippe Calatrava from 1958, a gift from his grandfather on his 21st birthday. It was elegant in its simplicity, with a clean, ivory-white face, slender gold hands, and a worn, brown alligator strap. To Sloane, it was an asset. "You know what that's worth, right?" she had asked him once, eyeing it with the same predatory gleam she reserved for a vulnerable startup. "We could flip that for a down payment on the Hamptons place." He had simply replied, "It was my grandfather's," which to him was a complete explanation, but to her was just a statement of boring provenance. She couldn't see the watch for what it was, a philosophy, a piece of a man's soul. Its value wasn't in its auction price, but in its quiet, steady movement. The intricate, hand-wound mechanism was a marvel of patient engineering, a testament to the idea that true lasting value is built slowly, meticulously, and with integrity. Everything Ether, her volatile fintech company, was not. The watch didn't scream for attention. It simply was. It was a legacy, a tangible connection to Edward Sterling, a man who had built a dynasty not with frantic energy and slick presentations, but with wisdom, foresight, and a profound understanding of human character. Arthur ran his thumb over the smooth, cool crystal. The watch had been on his grandfather's wrist when he signed the initial seed investment papers for Oracle, a quiet bet made in a garage that would eventually metastasize into a world-altering fortune. It had been on his wrist in boardrooms, at his wedding, and on the day he'd made Arthur promise to live a life of substance before revealing his own. The gentle, almost imperceptible, tick-tick-tick of the movement was a sound Arthur found deeply comforting, a constant rhythmic counterpoint to the chaotic, high-frequency trading of Sloane's world. It was the sound of real-time passing, not the frantic, compressed time of quarterly reports and funding rounds. Tonight, however, the ticking felt different. It wasn't comforting. It felt like a countdown. Each tiny click of the escapement a second closer to a moment of reckoning he had spent his entire adult life trying to avoid. The watch on his wrist knew the truth, and it was patiently, relentlessly, marking the time until he was finally forced to act on it. The conference call ended. The silence that descended upon the loft was heavier, more fraught than the noise had been. Arthur remained at the table, a solitary figure in the cavernous space. He heard the door to her office open, and the soft, tired sigh she let out when she thought no one was listening. It was one of the few genuine sounds he ever heard her make. She appeared in the doorway of the dining area, her polished armor showing the faintest of cracks. The harsh glare of her phone illuminated her face, casting long shadows under her eyes. "They're sending another list of diligence questions tomorrow," she said, her voice flat, stripped of its earlier performance. "From the man himself," they said. "He wants to know our 5-year plan for employee retention in a downturn." Who the hell asks that? Arthur knew exactly who. It was the kind of question his grandfather always asked. A question about people, not just numbers. It was a question designed to probe the foundation of a company, not just its glittering facade. "That sounds thorough," Arthur offered quietly, the understatement a small, private act of rebellion. She scoffed, running a hand through her perfectly styled hair. "It's insane. It's like he's trying to find a reason to say no. I have to fly to Geneva tomorrow to meet with the Swiss bankers. You'll have to handle the cleaner." She didn't look at him as she spoke, her attention already on booking a flight, her mind a million miles away in a world of wire transfers and non-disclosure agreements. He was a domestic task on her to-do list, a footnote in the epic of her ambition. He watched her walk away, a sleek silhouette disappearing into the master bedroom. He was alone again, in the quiet, surrounded by the trappings of a wealth that wasn't hers, a life built on a lie he had willingly perpetuated. He rose from the table and walked back to his study, the scent of old books welcoming him home. He sat at his desk and pulled the worn, leather-bound journal from the backpack. He opened it to a random page, his grandfather's elegant, confident script filling the page. The entry was dated years ago, but the words seemed written for this very moment. "Power is a tool, my boy. It is meant to build, to protect. But left unused in the face of corrosion, it becomes a poison, first to the things you love, and then to yourself." The truth of the words settled over him, cold and absolute. His passivity, his patience, had not been a virtue. It had been a form of complicity, allowing the corrosion to spread. The ticking of the watch on his wrist no longer sounded like a countdown to an event. It sounded like a call to arms. The decision to act wasn't a thunderclap. It was a slow, cold dawn breaking inside him, illuminating the wreckage of his marriage with an unforgiving light. His grandfather's words, read from the journal just moments before, had become a verdict. Power left unused in the face of corrosion becomes a poison. For years, Arthur had mistaken his inaction for patience, his silence for love. He saw now that it was a form of self-poisoning, a slow abdication of the man he was supposed to be in favor of the harmless caricature Sloane had created for him. He looked at the olive-drab backpack sitting on his desk, no longer seeing it as a simple canvas bag, but as a Pandora's box he had kept sealed out of fear. Fear of what it would mean to open it, to unleash the power contained within. Fear of what that power would do to her. And more terrifyingly, what it would do to him. But the fear of living one more day as a ghost in his own life, a pro bono project, in his own home, was suddenly greater. His hand, which a moment ago had trembled, was now unnervingly steady as he reached for the main zipper tab. The metal was cold against his fingertips, a small, hard point of reality in a room filled with the ghosts of history and literature. He pulled it slowly, deliberately. The sound of the zipper's teeth parting was a harsh, grating tear in the fabric of the room's deep silence, a sound of finality, like the drawing of a curtain on the first act of a tragedy. The interior of the bag was a dark maw, smelling faintly of the acidic tang of old paper and the rich, earthy scent of the journal's leather cover. He knew every item within by touch, by weight, by its place in the carefully ordered chaos. This was not an act of spontaneous rage. It was a ritual he had rehearsed 1,000 times in his mind, a ceremony of reclamation. He was no longer just Arthur Covington, the history teacher. He was now reaching into the bag to retrieve the tools of Arthur Sterling, the man his grandfather had raised him to be, a steward, a protector, and if necessary, a judge. The corrosion had spread too far, and the time for gentle remedies was over. It was now time for surgery, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it would not be bloodless. His fingers bypassed the familiar comfort of the worn journal and the smooth, heavy weight of the old key, searching instead for the rigid edge of a specific manila folder tucked into a discreet inner sleeve. He pulled it free, the folder a mundane, bureaucratic object that felt profane in its simplicity, given the power it represented. The tab was labeled in his own neat block print, N.H. Trust, Deed of Formation. He placed it on the leather blotter of his desk, the pale folder a stark island against the dark, rich green. He paused, his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He could hear the faint, muffled sound of Sloane's voice from her office down the hall, the smooth, persuasive cadence of a predator closing in on her prey. The sound was a constant, low-frequency hum of anxiety, a reminder of the proximity of the enemy, of how easily his sanctuary could be breached. With a deep, steadying breath that did little to calm the tremor in his gut, he opened the folder. The document inside was thick, printed on heavy, cream-colored bond paper that crackled with importance. The first page was a dense block of legalese, but his eyes were drawn to the bottom, to the embossed, deep blue seal of Sullivan and Cromwell, the white shoe law firm that had managed his family's affairs for 3 generations. Beneath it, 2 signatures stood in stark contrast. His grandfather's sprawling, confident autograph, and his own, signed on his 25th birthday, looking smaller, more hesitant, as if the hand that wrote it understood the crushing weight of the legacy it was accepting. He ran his thumb over his legal name printed in stark, immutable type. Arthur Sterling Covington, sole beneficiary and future trustee. The name felt alien, the name of a king from a distant land. Here, in this loft, he was just Arthur. The irony was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. He was the very mystery she was chasing, the financial titan she fantasized about, and she saw him as nothing more than an obstacle to be managed and, ultimately, discarded. He carefully turned the page, his movements slow and silent, terrified that the rustle of the paper might somehow carry down the hall and alert her to his betrayal of the role she had assigned him. He continued to sift through the contents of the folder, his initial fear slowly being displaced by a cold, clarifying anger. He found the most recent consolidated statement of assets for Northwood Holdings, a document his financial advisors compiled for him quarterly, a summary of a kingdom he had chosen to ignore. He unfolded the pages, the sheer density of the numbers swimming before his eyes, representing a reality so far removed from his $50 salary that it felt like fiction. The portfolio was a silent, sprawling empire built on his grandfather's quiet foresight. There were the legacy holdings, a massive foundational block of Oracle stock, untouched for decades, a significant stake in Berkshire Hathaway that made Warren Buffett a distant, unknowing business partner. But then there were the other, more active investments managed by his family office, controlling interests in a portfolio of commercial real estate across Midtown Manhattan, including, he noted with a jolt of bitter amusement, the very building that housed Ether's primary competitor, a fact Sloane was blissfully unaware of. There were venture capital arms seated in biotech, sustainable energy, and AI, the very sectors Sloane desperately tried to impress with her own flimsy enterprise. The numbers were astronomical, abstract, A series of zeros that seemed to mock the tangible struggles of his daily life, the condescending glances, the quiet dismissals. He saw a line item for a portfolio of fine art, managed out of Geneva, and remembered Sloane scoffing at a gallery, saying they could never afford a real Degas. According to the statement, he owned 3. The document in his hands was not just a list of assets. It was a weapon. Every line item was a bullet. Every stock symbol a loaded chamber. He had kept this arsenal locked away, believing that love required him to be unarmed. Now, listening to the distant murmur of her voice as she sold her hollow vision to his own representatives, he realized that in a war, the only thing pacifism guarantees is your own defeat. He had been a fool, mistaking a battlefield for a partnership, and the cost of that mistake was about to be calculated. The numbers began to feel suffocating, the sheer scale of the wealth a corrupting force in the quiet, scholarly air of his study. He pushed the financial statements aside, the crisp paper sliding silently across the leather. He needed to reconnect with the why, not just the what. His hand, almost of its own volition, went back into the backpack and retrieved the worn, leather-bound journal. The object felt warm, alive in his hands, a direct conduit to his grandfather's mind. The scent of the old paper and leather was a calming antidote to the sterile, metallic smell of money that had filled the room. He didn't open it at random this time. He flipped through the delicate, tissue-thin pages to a section near the end, one he had bookmarked years ago with a simple, folded piece of paper. His eyes found the entry, dated shortly after his grandmother's death. The script was slightly less steady than usual, betraying the old man's grief, but the words were as clear and solid as granite. A man's true fortune, Edward had written, is not the empire he builds, but the person with whom he chooses to share its quietest rooms. Seek a partner who is not impressed by the scale of your holdings, but one who understands the architecture of your soul. Wealth can buy a spectacle, a performance of loyalty. Only character can recognize character. Arthur closed his eyes, the words searing themselves into his mind. The architecture of your soul. Sloane had never even bothered to look at the blueprints. She had seen a quaint, structurally unsound building she could use for temporary shelter, while she drafted plans for her own skyscraper. He had given her access to the quietest rooms of his heart, and she had seen them only as empty spaces to be renovated, monetized, and eventually demolished. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside his study, and his entire body went rigid. He held his breath, every muscle tensed, his ears straining to hear over the frantic pounding of his own blood. He imagined her hand on the doorknob, the door swinging open to find him here, surrounded by the evidence of his secret life. The moment passed. The sound did not repeat, but the illusion of safety was shattered, and he knew that the quiet rooms of his life were no longer a sanctuary, but a prison he had to escape. The time for passive reflection was over. The journal had provided the moral clarity. The financial statements had provided the ammunition. Now he had to fire the first shot. From a hidden, felt-lined compartment at the very bottom of the backpack, a custom edition his grandfather had commissioned decades ago for carrying sensitive documents, Arthur retrieved a slim, matte black laptop. It was an object of profound anonymity, with no logos, no distinguishing marks. It was cold and severe to the touch, a stark contrast to the organic warmth of the books and wood surrounding him. He opened it, and the machine booted up in complete silence, the screen glowing to life with a simple, encrypted command prompt. This was his other life, the one that existed in secure servers and encrypted channels, the life of Mr. Sterling. His fingers, accustomed to the gentle turning of fragile pages, moved with surprising speed and confidence over the keyboard. He logged into a secure, Proton-based email account, an address known only to a handful of people in the world. The interface was stark, functional, designed for privacy, not aesthetics. He began to compose a new message, his posture hunched, the pale light from the screen casting his face in a ghostly, determined glow. The recipient was a single, discreet address belonging to Marcus Davies, the senior partner at his law firm and the executor of his grandfather's estate. The clicks of the keys were the only sound in the room, each one feeling impossibly loud, a tiny betrayal of his covert action. He imagined Sloane, just down the hall, hearing the faint tapping and wondering what her bookish husband could possibly be typing with such intensity. The subject line was simple: Ether. The body of the email was equally concise, stripped of all emotion, a string of commands that would set in motion a corporate machine of terrifying power and precision. Marcus, he wrote, initiate full-spectrum due diligence on the fintech startup Ether. I want a complete forensic accounting, a deep dive into their IP, and a full workup on their executive leadership, particularly the CEO, Sloan Gable. Spare no expense. Full anonymity protocol must be maintained. I want them to feel the pressure, but I want them to think it's coming from God, not from me. He paused, his finger hovering over the final period, the weight of the coming storm settling heavily upon his shoulders. He read the email one last time, the words on the screen looking back at him like a declaration of war, written in a foreign language he was only just beginning to understand. This was it, the point of no return. His finger, slick with a thin film of sweat, rested on the trackpad, the cursor blinking over the send icon. For a fleeting second, he saw Sloane's face in his mind, not the hard, ambitious CEO, but the woman he had fallen in love with years ago, laughing at a bad joke in a Greenwich Village coffee shop, her eyes bright with a light he hadn't seen in years. The memory was a ghost, a painful, fleeting echo of a life that was already over. He had not killed that life. He was simply signing its death certificate. He clicked the button. The email vanished from the screen without a sound, sent into the digital ether to an old man in a corner office on Park Avenue who would, upon reading it, set in motion a series of events that would utterly dismantle Sloane's world. Arthur felt a strange, hollow calm descend upon him. It wasn't triumph or satisfaction. It was the quiet, grim resolve of a general who has just committed his troops to a battle he knows will be costly, but necessary. He methodically closed the laptop, wiped it clean of fingerprints with a soft cloth, and placed it back in its hidden compartment. He arranged the folders, slipped the journal back into its sleeve, and zipped the backpack shut, the sound now feeling less like a tear and more like the ceiling of a tomb. He stood up and walked to the window of his study, pushing aside the heavy velvet curtain. He didn't look at his reflection. He looked out at the glittering panorama of the Manhattan skyline, a sprawling, indifferent constellation of ambition and power. It was her city, her natural habitat. She had always made him feel small against its backdrop. But now, for the first time, he wasn't looking at it as a spectator from the cheap seats. He was looking at it as a player who had just moved a powerful piece onto the board, a piece she would never see coming. She had wanted to build an empire, and in her arrogance, she never realized she had been sleeping next to an emperor. Act 3. The Devastating Discovery. The act of sending the email to Marcus Davies was like pulling a pin from a grenade. Arthur felt the immediate, chilling finality of it, the knowledge that an explosion was now inevitable, its timing and trajectory irrevocably set in motion. Yet, the grim satisfaction was fleeting, replaced by a gnawing, insidious feeling that he had only addressed the symptom, not the disease. The due diligence would pressure Sloane. It would expose the cracks in Ether's foundation, but it was an external attack. It didn't explain the corrosion that had taken root inside his own home, inside the very architecture of their life together. He looked at the olive drab backpack, now sitting zipped and seemingly dormant on his desk. He had retrieved the tools of his public power, the instruments of Northwood Holdings. But he knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in his veins, that the bag held more. It held the records of his private life, the mundane paperwork of a marriage he had entered into with a naive, open heart. He had always left those details to Sloane, the joint accounts, the property management, the filings. He was the academic, the man of ideas. She was the pragmatist, the woman of action. It had seemed like a natural division of labor, a partnership. Now, it felt like a catastrophic abdication of his own security. His hands, which had been so steady when commanding his financial empire, trembled as he reached for the zipper again. This felt different, more dangerous. Prying into the finances of her company was business. Prying into the finances of their marriage felt like a violation, a desecration of the last, fragile illusion of trust. The sound of the zipper opening for a second time that night was quieter, more furtive, like the whisper of a confession in an empty church. He slid his hand past the journal and the deed of trust, his fingers searching for a different set of manila folders, ones marked not with the insignia of his family office, but with the mundane, shared label of their last name. He needed to understand the full extent of the rot, and he feared, with every fiber of his being, that it had spread far deeper than he could have ever imagined. He pulled out a thick folder simply labeled Loft. Inside, he expected to find the familiar, comforting documents of their shared home. The original deed from their purchase 4 years ago, the property tax statements he occasionally glanced at, the insurance policies. The scent that rose from the papers was sterile, the clean chemical smell of a modern law office. a sharp contrast to the organic, aged scent of his books. His fingers shuffled through the top pages, his eyes scanning the familiar typography. He found the original deed of sale, a heavy document on thick, cream-colored paper. He saw his own signature next to hers, his a thoughtful, rounded script, hers a sharp, aggressive slash of ink, a signature that seemed to be in a hurry to get to the next line. A wave of nostalgia, so potent it was nauseating, washed over him. He remembered the day they had signed it, the feeling of her hand in his, the shared dream of building a life within those walls. He had believed it was a foundation. He now saw it was just another asset on her balance sheet. He pushed the memory away, forcing himself to be methodical, to be the historian examining primary sources for evidence of a hidden truth. He continued to leaf through the stack, his thumb catching on a set of documents stapled together near the bottom. These papers were different. The letterhead wasn't from the real estate attorneys they had used for the purchase. It was from a different entity, a commercial lender he didn't recognize, Sterling Financial Group, a cruel, cosmic joke of a name. The date on the first page was from only 6 months ago. His blood ran cold. He unfolded the document, his eyes jumping across the dense legal jargon, searching for the defining words. He found them in the third paragraph, stark and brutal in their clarity. Second mortgage agreement. The words seemed to vibrate on the page, a testament to a betrayal so profound it felt like a physical blow to the chest. He saw the principal amount, a staggering $750,000, an amount that would have required his explicit, notarized consent. He scanned down to the signature page, his heart pounding a frantic, suffocating rhythm against his ribs. There, at the bottom, was his name, scrawled in a passable but soulless imitation of his own hand. A forgery so blatant, so audacious, that it stole the very air from his lungs. This wasn't just a lie, it was a crime. A quiet, calculated theft committed under the guise of their shared life. The pain was a white-hot flash, blinding and absolute, but it was quickly consumed by a creeping, glacial cold. He stared at the forged signature, a grotesque parody of his own identity, and felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he were observing the life of a stranger. The man who had signed that document, the real Arthur Covington, had been sitting in this very study, perhaps reading Faulkner or grading papers, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife was downstairs, methodically dismantling their financial foundation and stealing his name. He traced the forged signature with his finger, the ink smooth and foreign under his touch. He could see the subtle hesitations in the loops, the slight tremor in the downstroke, the tiny imperfections of a lie. He leaned back in his chair, the old leather groaning in protest, and closed his eyes, forcing himself to connect the dots. The timeline was damning. 6 months ago. That was when the tech blogs had started whispering about Ether's cash flow problems. When the first round of layoffs had happened, the ones Sloan had dismissed as strategic restructuring. She hadn't been restructuring. She had been hemorrhaging. The $750,000 wasn't for a renovation or an investment. It was an emergency transfusion to keep her company alive, to maintain the illusion of success just long enough to land a whale. And the whale she was hunting was Northwood Holdings. The whale was him. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it was almost impressive in its sociopathy. She had used a forged signature on a loan against their shared home to secure the funds necessary to court an investor, who was, in fact, the co-owner of that very home. It was a snake eating its own tail, a closed loop of deceit so perfect and contained that he felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. He opened his eyes and looked at the document again, but the numbers and words had started to blur. He was no longer seeing a mortgage agreement. He was seeing a blueprint of her character, a detailed schematic of a soul utterly devoid of loyalty, a person who saw love not as a sanctuary, but as a resource to be leveraged and liquidated. The warmth he had once felt for her, the patient affection, the quiet hope, it was all gone, burned away by the cold, hard proof of her treachery, leaving behind nothing but the ash of their shared past. His mind, now a machine of cold logic, demanded more. If she was capable of forgery, of this level of calculated financial betrayal, there had to be more. This couldn't be the entire plan. It was too crude, too desperate. It was the act of a gambler, not a strategist. And Sloan, whatever else she was a strategist. He pushed the mortgage documents aside, his hands moving with a new, grim purpose, digging deeper into the backpack's contents. He found another folder, thinner this time, its tab marked with a single word: prenup. He had almost forgotten about it. He remembered the day their lawyers had presented it, just before the wedding. Sloane had framed it as a simple necessity, a modern formality. "It's just to protect Ether," she had said, her voice a melody of sweet reason. "It's my baby, my only real asset. This just ensures it stays mine, and everything else we build together." He had agreed without a second thought, eager to show her that he trusted her, that he wasn't interested in her money, a gesture of love that now seemed like an act of profound, suicidal stupidity. He pulled out the document, its pages held together by a simple brass brad. The paper felt different, slicker than the deed, the typeface sharp and modern. He began to read, not as a loving fiancé, but as a hostile witness, dissecting every clause, every subsection, searching for the hidden weapon he knew must be there. He skipped past the standard boilerplate, his eyes scanning for the language concerning business assets and future earnings. And then he found it. A clause buried deep in the 7th article. A paragraph so dense with convoluted legalese that his younger self had likely skimmed right over it. The clause stipulated that while Ether itself was protected as a premarital asset, any significant capital infusion from a third-party investor post-marriage would trigger a re-evaluation of the company's value, and that a portion of that newly created value could be considered shared marital property if both partners were deemed to have contributed to the environment of success. The language was vague, insidious, a legalistic time bomb. He understood instantly. Securing the Northwood investment wouldn't just save her company. It would transform a premarital asset into a marital one, a pot of money he would suddenly have a claim to, and more importantly, a pot she would have to split in a divorce. The pieces were locking into place, revealing a picture of a predator setting a long, patient, and devastatingly brilliant trap. He felt a sudden, urgent need to see the entire board, to understand the final move in her meticulously planned game. His fingers, now numb with a cold and profound dread, fumbled at the back of the prenup folder. They brushed against a single folded sheet of paper that hadn't been there when he'd first filed the document away years ago. It was a different kind of paper, thin and slightly translucent, the kind used for internal memos in a law office. It was folded in thirds, and as he opened it, the letterhead of Sloane's divorce attorney, a notoriously ruthless shark from a firm known for its scorched earth tactics, seemed to scream at him from the top of the page. It wasn't a formal document, it was a strategy memo, a list of action items, apparently sent from her lawyer to her, a copy she had carelessly, arrogantly tucked away. His eyes devoured the bullet points, each one a nail being hammered into the coffin of his life. 1. Finalize Northwood term sheet. Do not sign until we give the green light. The valuation increase is critical. 2. Immediately post-signing, file the attached petition. We will serve him at the school to maximize leverage and public humiliation. 3. Invoke Article 7 of the prenup, arguing his stable, supportive home life was a direct contribution to the environment of success that secured the investment. 4. Initial settlement offer to include a full buyout of his half of the loft, using funds from the investment, a significant alimony payment based on the new marital asset valuation, and a comprehensive ironclad NDA to protect your public image. Tucked behind the memo was a draft of the divorce petition itself, his name printed coldly alongside hers, the soulless legal language painting him as an emotionally distant and financially dependent spouse, a burden she had carried with grace and fortitude. He saw it all then, the complete, horrifying, and elegant cruelty of her plan. It wasn't just that she was leaving him. It wasn't just that she was stealing from him. She was planning to use his own money, the Northwood investment, to buy him out of his home, pay him off with a fraction of his own fortune, and then legally gag him to ensure the world would only ever hear her version of the story. It was a corporate takeover applied to a human heart, an act of erasure so complete it left him breathless. A strange and terrible calm washed over Arthur. The man who had been sitting in this chair just an hour ago, the gentle husband, the quiet academic, was gone. He had been murdered, executed by 1,000 paper cuts of legal documents and financial statements. The pain, the shock, the grief, they had been burned away in the inferno of her betrayal, leaving behind something hard, cold, and diamond-sharp. A pure, crystalline rage, a righteous fury so clean and focused it felt like a state of grace. He was no longer a victim. He was an adversary who had just been handed the enemy's complete battle plan. He looked down at the collection of papers spread across his desk, the forged mortgage, the weaponized prenup, the divorce strategy memo. They were no longer instruments of his destruction. They were now exhibits for the prosecution. He picked up the memo from her lawyer, the thin paper crinkling in his steady hand. Serve him at the school to maximize leverage and public humiliation. The line replayed in his mind, not as a threat, but as a revelation of the character of the woman he was dealing with. She wasn't just leaving him, she wanted to destroy him, to salt the earth of his entire existence, to make an example of him. He carefully folded the memo and slid it, along with the other documents, back into the folder. He placed the folder back inside the olive-drab backpack, his movements now precise and deliberate, the actions of a soldier meticulously packing his gear before a dawn raid. He zipped the bag shut, the sound final and decisive. He looked at his wrist, at the quiet, steady ticking of his grandfather's Patek Philippe. The gentle rhythm no longer felt like a countdown to his own demise. It was a metronome, calm and implacable, setting the tempo for the war to come. She had mistaken his quietness for weakness, his patience for passivity. She had no idea that she had not been living with a museum curator, but with a sleeping king. And she, in her breathtaking arrogance, had just kicked the throne. The silence in the study was no longer a sanctuary. It had become an armory. The crystalline rage that had seized Arthur in the wake of his discovery did not manifest as a physical outburst. No books were thrown. No curses were muttered into the hallowed paper-scented air. Instead, it underwent a strange and terrible alchemy, transmuting from a molten, white-hot emotion into something cold, dense, and perfectly structured. It was the calm of a surgeon before a life-altering incision, the profound stillness of a predator that has finally, irrevocably scented its prey. The man who had grieved for his marriage was gone, replaced by a strategist, a general reviewing a battlefield map that only he could fully comprehend. His movements became fluid and economical, stripped of all hesitation. He did not pace. He did not sigh. He walked to his desk, his worn leather shoes making no sound on the antique Persian rug, and retrieved his phone from where it lay beside the now-closed backpack. The device felt alien in his hand, a slab of cold glass and metal, a tool of the world Sloane inhabited. But he now saw it, like everything else, as an instrument to be wielded. His thumb moved across the screen, his touch deliberate, navigating not to his recent calls, but deep into his contacts, to a name that had not been summoned in over a year. Marcus Davies, Sterling Estate. He pressed the call button and lifted the phone to his ear, his gaze fixed on the window, on the indifferent, glittering lights of the city that had for so long been her stage. The line clicked, and a voice, old and resonant as a cello, answered with a simple, questioning, "Arthur." There was no surprise, only a patient readiness. Marcus had been his grandfather's man, a consigliere in a bespoke suit, a guardian of the Sterling legacy, who understood that a call from Arthur at this hour, after so long a silence, could mean only one thing. The quiet king was finally ready to go to war. "Marcus," Arthur said, his own voice sounding foreign to him, stripped of its usual academic warmth, now a flat, toneless instrument of command. "I need you to clear your calendar for tomorrow morning. All of it. I'm coming to your office at 8. And Marcus, bring the entire Northwood Holdings file. We have a problem. A very corrosive one." He ended the call before the old lawyer could reply, the silence rushing back in to fill the void. The first move had been made, a quiet, almost imperceptible shift of a pawn that would, in time, threaten the entire board. And he knew with chilling certainty that the game would not end until the opposing queen had been taken. The next morning, the air in Marcus Davies's office felt a century removed from the sterile minimalism of the Soho loft. It was a space that smelled of real power, an olfactory cocktail of aged leather from the deep Chesterfield sofas, the sweet, lingering ghost of Cuban cigars smoked decades ago, and the dry, acidic tang of countless legal documents that had shaped fortunes and toppled empires. Sunlight, thick with the dust motes of history, streamed through the tall, mullioned windows, illuminating the rich, dark mahogany of a desk that had been in the Davies family for 3 generations. It was a room built on permanence, on the unshakable belief that some things, loyalty, integrity, and the crushing weight of a well-executed legal strategy, were immutable. Arthur sat across that desk, the olive-drab backpack resting on the floor beside him like a loyal, weary soldier. He had not spoken since his initial greeting. Instead, he had methodically, silently, unpacked the evidence of his wife's treachery, laying each document out on the polished wood, like a coroner, arranging the instruments of a murder. First, the forged second mortgage. its counterfeit signature a stark, ugly wound on the page. Then, the weaponized prenuptial agreement, its insidious clauses now highlighted in a faint yellow. Finally, he placed the divorce strategy memo from Sloane's lawyer on top, a single flimsy sheet of paper that felt heavier than all the others combined. Marcus, a man whose face was a roadmap of shrewd negotiations and courtroom battles, read each document without a word. His expression, initially one of professional concern, hardened into a mask of cold, controlled fury. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic ticking of a massive grandfather clock in the corner, a sound that echoed the steady, implacable beat of Arthur's Patek Philippe. When he finished, Marcus folded his hands, his gaze meeting Arthur's. There was no pity in his eyes, only a shared, grim understanding. She used the name of a shell corporation, Sterling Financial, for the mortgage, Marcus stated, his voice a low growl. The arrogance is breathtaking. She was mocking you, Arthur. Mocking your grandfather. He paused, his fingers steepled. What are your instructions? Arthur leaned forward, the leather of his chair groaning softly. First, he said, his voice as cold and clear as ice. We stop the bleeding. I want you to immediately sever my name from every joint account, every credit line, every asset she can touch. Create a new, impenetrable trust for all personal holdings. I want her financial world to shrink, quietly, overnight, without her knowing why. Second, you are to use the full resources of the firm to counter Sue for fraud. But you will not file yet. You will prepare the case down to the last damning detail, and you will wait for my signal. Marcus nodded slowly, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time. Consider it done. We will build a cage for her so perfectly constructed, she won't even see the bars until the door is locked. Arthur felt a sliver of the weight on his soul lift. Not because the pain was gone, but because it was now being forged into a weapon. And he knew that the quiet, patient work of building a trap was far more devastating than the noisy, chaotic act of springing it. Returning to the loft that evening was the most difficult performance of Arthur's life. He walked through the heavy steel door, the familiar thump of its closing now sounding like a cell door locking him in with his own executioner. The air was thick with her scent, that expensive, aggressive fragrance that now smelled to him like poison. He had to force his muscles to relax, to adopt the familiar, slightly stooped posture of the harmless academic she expected him to be. He had to school his features into a mask of benign neutrality, erasing the cold fury that was now the permanent landscape of his inner world. He found her in the kitchen, a whirlwind of manic energy, her back to him as she furiously typed on her laptop, which was propped up on the cold marble island. She was so consumed by her ambition, so focused on the digital illusion of her company, that she didn't even hear him enter. Long day? He asked, his voice carefully calibrated to sound weary, unremarkable, the voice of the man she thought she knew. She started, spinning around, a flash of annoyance in her eyes at being interrupted before it was replaced by a look of strained condescension. You have no idea, she sighed, running a hand through her hair. Northwood, they're absolute sadists. They've just sent another diligence request. They want a full analysis of our customer churn rate correlated with regional marketing spend for the last 18 months. It's a make-work project. It's insane. It's like they're trying to break us. Arthur felt a grim, dark satisfaction curl in his stomach. He was the sadist. The request had been his own invention, crafted that very afternoon with Marcus, designed specifically to consume the maximum amount of Ether's remaining man-hours and capital. He simply nodded, feigning a sympathetic ignorance. That sounds complicated, he offered, the understatement a small private joke. She scoffed, turning back to her screen. It's beyond complicated, Arthur. It's the big leagues. You wouldn't understand. He stood there for a long moment, watching her, a ghost in his own home. He was a stranger to her, a piece of sentimental furniture she was already planning to sell off. The love he had once felt was a phantom limb, an ache for something that was no longer there. He had to live this lie, to breathe this poisoned air, to smile and nod while she sharpened the knife she planned to slide between his ribs, because the success of his counterstrike depended on one critical element: her absolute, unshakable belief that he was, and always would be, weaker than her. In the sanctuary of his study, with the door firmly closed, Arthur transformed back into the king. The mild-mannered husband persona was shed like a heavy coat, left in a heap by the door. Here, surrounded by the silent counsel of his books, he was Mr. Sterling, the reclusive, invisible hand guiding the most powerful force in his wife's universe. He sat at his desk and opened the matte black anonymous laptop, the screen glowing to life in the dim, book-lined room. The encrypted email interface was his new battlefield, the keyboard his arsenal. For the next 3 hours, he became the architect of Sloane's personal hell, meticulously orchestrating the due diligence process with a level of precision and psychological cruelty that would have made a Grand Inquisitor proud. He sent a new set of instructions to the legal team at Sullivan and Cromwell, the ones fronting the Northwood investigation. His commands were specific, designed not just to gather information, but to inflict maximum psychological stress. "Query the resumes of their top 5 engineers," he typed, the clicks of the keys sharp and distinct in the silence. "I want to know if their stated qualifications from previous employers can be independently verified. Imply a concern about fraudulent credentials." He then drafted a separate email to his financial analysts. "Request a full, unredacted list of their initial seed investors and the terms of their shares. We need to know who has liquidation preference. Let them know we are concerned about the cap table's stability." Each request was a missile, carefully aimed at the weakest points in Ether's armor. He was attacking her people, her history, the very foundation of the story she told the world. He was using the language of her world, due diligence, cap tables, liquidation preference, as a form of psychological warfare. He could picture her on the receiving end of these queries, her confidence eroding with each new, impossible demand, the walls of her carefully constructed empire trembling. He felt no remorse, only a cold, clear sense of purpose. This was not about revenge, it was about justice. It was a controlled demolition, a process of stripping away every lie, every artifice, until only the ugly, rotten truth of her character remained, exposed for the world to see. He was not just a man she had betrayed. He was a force of nature she had foolishly provoked, and the storm was only just beginning to gather. The true genius of the trap, Arthur understood, was not in its complexity, but in its cruel and calculated manipulation of hope. After 2 weeks of relentless, soul-crushing pressure that had pushed Ether to the brink of financial and emotional collapse, he decided it was time to dangle the bait. He instructed Marcus to have the Northwood representatives reach out to Sloane with an unexpected message. The email was a masterpiece of corporate ambiguity, drafted by Arthur himself. It acknowledged the rigor of the diligence process and expressed cautious optimism regarding Ether's potential. It concluded by stating that while several significant concerns remained, the principal of Northwood Holdings was impressed by her tenacity and was willing to move to the final stage, an in-person pitch meeting to decide the fate of the investment. It was the faintest glimmer of light at the end of a long, dark tunnel, and he knew Sloane would cling to it with the desperation of a drowning woman. That night, she came home transformed. The exhaustion and stress were still etched on her face, but they were overlaid with a brittle, feverish excitement. She barely registered his presence as she burst into the loft, her phone pressed to her ear. "It's happening," she said, her voice a triumphant hiss to whomever was on the other end. "We got the meeting, the final pitch. The Kingmaker himself is going to be there." She finally looked at Arthur, a genuine, if condescending smile on her face for the first time in months. "Arthur, you're looking at the woman who is about to close the biggest deal of her life." He watched her, a master studying his own creation. He saw the flicker of relief, the surge of arrogance, the absolute conviction that her victory was now assured. She even poured him a glass of wine, a gesture of magnanimous triumph, seeing him as the last, minor loose end to be tied up before she ascended to her throne. She spoke to him of the future, a future that was all hers, never once noticing the cold, profound emptiness in his eyes. He raised his glass in a silent, bitter toast, the red wine looking like blood in the dim light of the loft. He was giving her this moment, this final, beautiful illusion of success, because he knew that the higher he let her climb, the more devastating her fall would be. The final days were a study in surreal, theatrical preparation. Arthur moved through his life with the detached calm of a director watching the final dress rehearsal of a play whose tragic ending only he knew. He chose the stage himself, instructing his team to secure the largest corner boardroom on the 64th floor of One Vanderbilt, a glass-walled precipice that offered a godlike panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline. It was a location chosen for its symbolism, a place of immense power, so high up that the real world below became an insignificant abstract map. He wanted her to feel as though she had reached the absolute summit of her ambitions, just before he sent her plummeting back to Earth. He specified every detail of the room's setup. The impossibly long mahogany table was to be empty, save for a single high-backed leather chair at its head, positioned with its back to the door. There would be no water glasses, no notepads, no army of lawyers or analysts, just the silent, imposing emptiness of the space and the lone figure of judgment. While Sloane spent her last 48 hours rehearsing her pitch, her voice echoing through the loft as she practiced her lines on synergy and scalability, Arthur made his own quiet preparations. He went to his study and selected a book from his collection, a pristine, first edition copy of The Great Gatsby, its dust jacket carefully preserved. It was a novel about self-made illusions, hollow fortunes, and the corrupting nature of a dream built on deceit. It was the perfect, silent closing argument. On the morning of the meeting, he dressed not in his usual tweed and corduroy, but in a bespoke, dark charcoal suit from Savile Row that had been his grandfather's, tailored to fit him perfectly. It was a suit that felt like armor, a uniform of the Sterling dynasty. As he looked at his reflection in the mirror, adjusting the simple silk tie, he saw a man he barely recognized. The gentle academic softness was gone from his eyes, replaced by the hard, unflinching gaze of a man who had been to the abyss and returned with a verdict. He picked up the copy of Gatsby, its familiar weight a comfort in his hand, and walked out of the loft for the last time as the man Sloane thought he was. He was not going to a meeting. He was ascending to a throne to deliver a sentence that had been earned in full, long ago. The evening air in the loft was different, charged with a strange, triumphant energy that emanated from Sloane like heat from asphalt. She had returned not with the usual frayed nerves of the past few weeks, but with a predatory stillness, a coiled calm that Arthur recognized as the quiet just before a decisive strike. He was in his study, the door purposefully left ajar, feigning absorption in a biography of Theodore Roosevelt. He heard the sharp, definitive click of her heels on the concrete floor, a sound that had become the soundtrack to his anxiety, but which now served as a cue, a signal that the first scene of the final act was about to begin. She didn't call his name. She simply appeared in the doorway, a silhouette against the harsh gallery lighting of the main living area. In her hand, she held a thick, pristine manila envelope. She didn't speak immediately, instead letting the silence stretch, a calculated theatrical pause designed to amplify his discomfort. Arthur slowly looked up from his book, carefully arranging his features into a mask of mild, scholarly inquiry, a look he had perfected over a lifetime of avoiding confrontation. "Sloane, everything all right?" he asked, his voice a soft, unassuming thing, the voice of a man who could be easily broken. She stepped into the room, her scent, sandalwood and cold ambition, invading his sanctuary of old paper and leather. She placed the envelope on his desk with a soft, deliberate thud. The sound was obscene in the quiet room. "Arthur," she began, her voice a low, smooth melody that had lost all its warmth and was now just a finely polished instrument of dismissal. "We need to talk. I think you know this hasn't been working for a very long time." He felt his heart, a traitorous organ, begin to hammer against his ribs, not with fear, but with a strange, exhilarating sense of confirmation. This was it. The script he had read in the dead of night was being performed for him, word for word. He looked from her cold, impassive face down to the envelope. "What is this?" he asked, his voice a carefully constructed whisper of dread. "It's the future, Arthur," she said, a cruel, thin smile touching her lips. "Mine, at least. Those are divorce papers. My lawyer will be in touch with yours, assuming you have one." She watched him, her eyes searching for the crack in his composure, for the pain she expected. The pain she felt was her due. He gave it to her. He let his shoulders slump, his gaze fall, his hand tremble slightly as he reached for the envelope. The paper felt heavy, official, its sharp edges a physical manifestation of the clean, brutal cut she was making. He was performing the role of the broken man, the discarded project, and as he felt the first genuine sting of tears, tears of rage, not sorrow, prick his eyes, he knew it was the most convincing and most important performance of his life. She let him absorb the initial shock, a predator allowing its prey a moment to comprehend the trap before tightening the snare. Arthur didn't open the envelope. He simply stared at it, the weight of it in his hands a stand-in for the weight of her betrayal. He was giving her the silence she needed to fill, the vacuum she would rush to occupy with her self-serving narrative. And she did not disappoint. "Look, I'm not going to be cruel about this," she said, her tone shifting to one of magnanimous condescension, the voice of a CEO explaining a necessary layoff to a redundant employee. "The prenup is very clear about Ether, of course, but everything else, the loft, our other assets, I'm prepared to be more than fair." He could hear the unspoken words from her lawyer's memo echoing in the space between them. Initial settlement offer to include a full buyout. She began to pace, the sound of her heels a relentless metronome marking the end of their life together. "I've secured the Northwood investment," she announced, the words dripping with a triumph she could no longer contain. "The term sheet is being drawn up as we speak. This deal changes everything. It puts me in a different league, Arthur. A different world. And that world requires a different kind of partner." There it was. "I need a partner to build an empire, not a damn museum curator." She was following the script with a breathtaking lack of imagination. He finally looked up at her, letting his eyes appear wide, wounded, confused. "A different partner?" he echoed, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. She stopped pacing and faced him, her expression a careful mixture of pity and resolve. "Yes, someone who understands the pressure, someone who contributes. For years, I've been the engine of this relationship, and you've been ballast. I created a supportive environment for you, for your hobbies, your little job, and that's fine. But I'm building an empire now, and frankly, I can't afford to carry a passenger any longer." The condescension was so pure, so perfectly distilled, it was almost beautiful in its ugliness. She was using the very words from the strategy memo: supportive environment, contribution, the legal framework she planned to use to steal a portion of his own fortune. He was a historian watching a tyrant rewrite history in real time, and the accuracy of his predictions was both horrifying and grimly satisfying. If you are enjoying this story of betrayal, please like this video to see how the tables will inevitably turn. She had no idea the man she saw as ballast was the very ocean on which her ship was about to sink. The next afternoon, the final piece of her victory puzzle was delivered by a sleek, silent courier. It was another thick envelope, this one bearing the logo of a top-tier corporate law firm, the one representing Northwood Holdings in the deal. It was, of course, a firm hand-picked by Marcus Davies, staffed by lawyers who were on Arthur's payroll. Sloane intercepted the package at the door, her hands trembling with a mixture of avarice and adrenaline. She carried it into the main living space and laid it on the vast, empty dining table, as if it were a holy relic. Arthur watched from the doorway of his study, a silent observer at the theater of her self-destruction. "It's here," she said, her voice a reverent whisper. The term sheet, the final binding offer from Northwood. She tore it open with a ferocity that was almost primal, her eyes scanning the pages, her expression shifting from intense concentration to one of pure, unadulterated ecstasy. The document was a work of art, a masterpiece of legal fiction crafted by Marcus's best minds. It was filled with the dense jargon and complex clauses that would signal its authenticity to Sloane. It stipulated an investment of $75 million for a minority stake, a valuation that would make Ether a celebrated unicorn overnight. It was everything she had ever dreamed of, a fantasy printed on heavy, cream-colored bond paper. She looked up at him, her face flushed with triumph, her eyes shining with a light he hadn't seen since the earliest days of their relationship, the light of a conqueror. "This is it, Arthur," she breathed. "This is the moment my entire life has been leading up to." She retrieved a pen from her briefcase, a heavy, expensive Mont Blanc that looked more like a weapon than a writing instrument. She uncapped it with a flourish and flattened the signature page on the table. "I wanted you to see this," she said, her voice laced with a final, parting shot of pity. "So you'd understand. It wasn't personal. It was just business." He watched as she signed her name, the ink a dark, aggressive slash across the page. He saw it not as a signature, but as a confession. She was signing her name to a lie, a contract with a phantom, a deal that would secure her nothing but her own ruin. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was the only sound in the room, a quiet, final act of a tragedy whose author stood watching from the shadows, his heart a cold, still stone in his chest. After she signed the term sheet, a profound and unsettling calm descended upon her. She had won. The war was over, and she was the undisputed victor. She spent the rest of the evening making calls, her voice a confident, triumphant melody as she informed her board members, her key employees, and her shark of a lawyer that the deal was done. Arthur remained in his study. The closed door, a fragile barrier against the sound of her victory celebration. He could hear her moving around the loft, the clink of a champagne flute, the confident stride of a woman who believes she is the master of her own universe. He felt nothing. The rage had cooled. The pain had numbed. All that remained was a vast, empty clarity. He was an historian at the end of a long, dark chapter, ready to write the epilogue. Around 10 o'clock, she appeared at his door one last time. She was dressed to go out, wearing a stunning, backless black dress that was both a celebration and a declaration of her newfound freedom. "I'm going out," she announced, not asking for permission, simply stating a fact. "A few of the board members are meeting me at Balthazar to celebrate. I've already transferred my things to my suite at the Mercer. My lawyer said it was cleaner that way." She paused, looking at him, the man she was leaving behind in the museum of their marriage. "Goodbye, Arthur," she said, the words utterly devoid of emotion. And then she was gone. The heavy front door clicked shut, the sound echoing in the sudden cavernous silence. He was alone. The performance was over. He walked out of his study and stood in the center of the vast white loft. The space felt sterile, impersonal. A stage whose lead actress had taken her final bow. Her scent still lingered in the air, a ghost of her presence. He looked at his wrist, at the steady, quiet ticking of his grandfather's watch. It was 10:17 p.m. He slowly walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the glittering, indifferent city. Tomorrow, at 9 a.m., Sloane Gable had a meeting on the 64th floor of 1 Vanderbilt to meet the reclusive kingmaker of Northwood Holdings. The Queen had taken the pawn and celebrated her victory, never once suspecting that the entire game was about to be turned upside down. The 64th floor of 1 Vanderbilt was a realm suspended between the heavens and the earth, a silent, climate-controlled pocket of reality where the city below was reduced to a silent, intricate tapestry of ambition and concrete. Arthur sat at the head of the mahogany table, a lone, still figure silhouetted against the blinding panorama of the Manhattan skyline. The air in the boardroom smelled of money, a sterile, inorganic scent of polished wood, expensive leather, and the faint, ozonic hum of the vast servers that powered the building's nervous system. In his hands, he held the first edition copy of The Great Gatsby, its worn, linen-textured cover a small, warm island of history in this cold ocean of modernity. He could feel the delicate grain of the old paper under his thumb, a tangible connection to a world of substance, a world Sloane had never understood. He wasn't nervous. The man who had once been crippled by anxiety and a desperate need for his wife's approval had been incinerated in the fire of her betrayal. What remained was a man of profound, chilling calm, a man who had accepted the terrible weight of his own power. He heard the faint chime of the private elevator, followed by the sound of approaching footsteps on the marble floor of the reception area. The sound was a symphony of misplaced confidence. The sharp, imperious clicks of Sloane's stilettos, accompanied by the more hesitant, shuffling cadence of her executive team. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open with a soft, hydraulic hiss. He didn't turn. He remained facing the window, a featureless shadow against the glass, letting the weight of the silence build, letting their anticipation curdle into uncertainty. He heard her clear her throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the vast room. "Mr. Sterling?" she began, her voice a carefully modulated instrument of deference and power, the voice she used to charm venture capitalists out of their fortunes. "Thank you for seeing us. I'm Sloane Gable, CEO of Ether." Arthur allowed the silence to stretch for 3 more heartbeats, a small private act of cruelty. Then slowly, deliberately, he closed the book, the soft thud of its covers coming together echoing like a gavel in the silent room, and began to turn. The high-backed leather chair swiveled with a smooth, expensive whisper, a slow, cinematic reveal that felt both inevitable and utterly cataclysmic. The moment the chair completed its turn, the carefully constructed universe of Sloane Gable did not just crack, it atomized. The face she saw was not that of a grizzled, unknown titan of industry, but the familiar, quiet face of the man she had left behind in the museum of their marriage. For a fraction of a second, her brain refused to process the information, her perfectly calibrated smile remaining frozen on her lips, a grotesque mask of confidence that no longer matched the dawning horror in her eyes. Then, the collapse began. It was a physical implosion, a chain reaction of shock that traveled through her body with visible force. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a waxy, translucent white, her expensive makeup suddenly looking like a cheap, theatrical facade. Her shoulders, held back in a posture of practiced power, slumped forward as if the strings holding her upright had been severed. Her mouth fell open, a silent, gaping O of disbelief, as a small, choked sound, a cross between a gasp and a sob, caught in her throat. The expensive tablet, loaded with the presentation she believed was the key to her future, slipped from her numb fingers and clattered onto the polished mahogany table. The sound a sharp, percussive crack in the suffocating silence. Her team, arrayed behind her like a Praetorian guard, stared in stunned, uncomprehending confusion, their gazes flickering between the ghost at the head of the table and their suddenly shattered leader. Arthur watched it all, his expression a mask of calm, dispassionate observation. He felt a profound and chilling finality, the grim satisfaction of a historian watching a long-predicted catastrophe unfold exactly as it was written. He placed the copy of The Great Gatsby gently on the table beside the fallen tablet. He looked past Sloane, his gaze sweeping over the terrified faces of her lieutenants before finally settling back on her. "Sloane," he said, his voice quiet, steady, and utterly devoid of the warmth she had once taken for granted. It was a voice she had never heard before, the voice of a judge, not a husband. "Please, have a seat. Tell me why I should invest in your future, when you've already forged, mortgaged, and sold ours for parts." The words hung in the air, each one a perfectly aimed stone, and he watched as the last vestiges of her composure crumbled into dust, leaving only the raw, ugly architecture of her greed exposed for all to see. Sloane's mind was a maelstrom of denial, a frantic scramble to reassemble the fragments of a reality that had just been detonated. She tried to speak, to form a rebuttal, a question, an accusation, but her throat had closed, her tongue a useless weight in her mouth. Her entire world had been predicated on a simple foundational belief that Arthur was small and she was large. The evidence before her, the suit, the room, the terrifying, cold authority in his eyes, was so profoundly and violently contradictory to that belief that her cognitive functions simply seized. It was in that moment of absolute paralysis that the boardroom's glass doors hissed open once more. The intrusion was not chaotic. It was precise, orderly, and infinitely more terrifying than any outburst of rage could have been. Marcus Davies entered first, a figure of old-world power in a dark, pinstriped suit, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He was flanked by two junior partners from his firm, both carrying heavy, leather-bound briefcases that they placed on the table with a soft, final thud. But it was the two figures who followed them that shattered the corporate sanctity of the room and dragged the proceedings into the brutal, physical world of consequence. Two uniformed officers from the New York Police Department stepped into the boardroom, their presence an immediate and shocking violation of the space. Their polished black shoes squeaked softly on the floor, their hands resting calmly on their belts, their eyes surveying the scene with a practiced, professional detachment. Arthur remained seated, a calm island in the center of the storm he had unleashed. Marcus walked to the side of the table, his movements deliberate, and opened one of the briefcases. He extracted a single document, the forged second mortgage agreement, and placed it directly in front of Sloane. "Sloane Gable," Marcus began, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried the full, crushing weight of the law. "My name is Marcus Davies. I represent Mr. Arthur Sterling Covington. This is a warrant for your arrest on charges of felony bank fraud, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft." He tapped the forged signature on the page. "The evidence is, as I'm sure you'll recognize, quite compelling." Sloane stared at the document, then at Marcus, then at Arthur, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic panic. She looked to her team for support, but they were already stepping back, their faces a mixture of fear and betrayal, distancing themselves from the contagion of her crimes. One of the officers stepped forward, his movements unhurried. The cold, metallic click of the handcuffs being unfastened from his belt was the loudest sound Sloane had ever heard, a definitive, irreversible period at the end of her life sentence. The finality of the moment was absolute. As officers guided a sobbing Sloane from the room, her empire dissolved in her wake. The lieutenants she had commanded minutes earlier sat frozen, witnessing a corporate execution. Arthur finally rose, moving not with his usual academic shuffle, but with the deliberate grace of a man in command. He didn't spare a glance for his wife. She was a closed chapter. He walked to Henderson, Sloane's second in command, and picked up the signed Northwood term sheet, the document Sloane believed was her Magna Carta. He held it up. "This," Arthur said, his voice quiet but resonating with cold power, "was a test of character. You all failed." With a calm motion, he tore the $75 million illusion in half. The ripping sound was violent in the stunned silence. He let the pieces flutter to the table. "Northwood Holdings has no interest in Ether. The company is insolvent, its assets frozen as evidence. Your stock options are worthless. You are all dismissed." He turned his back on them, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows, already seeing beyond the wreckage to the future he would build. The city felt different as Arthur walked away from One Vanderbilt. The air tasted of freedom, laced with street vendor hot dogs and damp earth. He walked with a measured stride, his grandfather's suit feeling like a second skin. The cold rage that had fueled him for weeks receded, leaving a vast, quiet emptiness. He found himself at the New York Public Library, ascending the marble steps past the stone lions. Inside the main reading room, the air was thick with the scent of aged paper and decaying knowledge, the smell of permanence. He sat at a long oak table under the warm glow of a green lamp, simply breathing in the silence. He thought of Sloane not with hatred, but with clinical pity. He pictured her in a holding cell,